There are watches you buy because they tell time. There are watches you buy because you made partner at a law firm and suddenly decided your personality needed a ceramic bezel. And then there are watches like this: a Rolex Explorer with a white dial, a watch that technically shouldn't exist. No catalog, no official announcement, no grand unveiling from Rolex, just whispers, grainy auction photos, forum arguments at 2 a.m., collectors zooming into dial textures like FBI analysts studying satellite images. They call it the Albino Explorer. And in the strange, obsessive little universe of vintage Rolex collecting, this thing became folklore because the Explorer was never supposed to be white. It was born in darkness, on rock faces, inside snowstorms, at the roof of the world. A tool watch forged from one of mankind's greatest adventures, the conquest of Mount Everest. And somehow, decades later, a ghost slipped through the cracks. A white dial explorer, the horological equivalent of finding a polar bear in the Sahara. Before the Explorer became a luxury object for hedge fund managers wearing Patagonia vests in airport lounges, it was survival equipment. In the early 1950s, Rolex had already built a reputation around ruggedness with the Oyster case. Waterproof, dustproof, reliable. That sort of thing you'd want strapped to your wrist if dying of exposure was a realistic possibility before lunch. So Rolex did what Rolex has always done brilliantly: attach itself to human achievement. By the 1930s, the company was already supplying oyster watches to Himalayan expeditions. Then came 1953, the British Everest expedition, led by John Hunt, men climbing into what was essentially a frozen death zone, carrying oxygen tanks, wool clothing, and the psychological stability of people who willingly walk towards avalanches. The expedition carried Oyster Perpetual watches, and on May 29, 1953, humanity reached the summit of Everest for the very first time. Rolex immediately understood the marketing power of this moment, because if your watch survives Everest, it could probably survive a disappointing dinner in Geneva. Now, historians still debate exactly which watches made it to the summit itself. Some evidence points to Smith's watches being worn during the final ascent. Even today, watch nerds argue about it, with the intensity of medieval theologians debating angels. But the important thing is, the Everest expedition directly inspired the creation of the Explorer. And in 1953, the Rolex Explorer was born. The first official Explorer references appeared in 1953. References like the 6350 and later the 6610 established the formula: black dial, highly legible markers, the iconic 369 layout, rugged oyster case. Simple, functional, beautiful. No unnecessary nonsense, no tourbillon spinning around like a caffeinated carnival ride. Just a watch built to survive terrible places. The Explorer became part of Rolex's growing professional lineup, alongside the Rolex Submariner and the Rolex GMT Master. And the black dial wasn't accidental. Black gave maximum legibility in harsh conditions: snow glare, dark caves, night climbing, high altitude. The Explorer dial became sacred, which is why what happened next was so bizarre. Because somewhere in the 1950s, a handful of explorers appeared with white dials. Not cream, not silver, white. Collectors would later call them albino explorers. Vintage Rolex collecting runs on myth. Tiny details become religion. A misplaced serif on a dial can add $50,000 to a watch. So when collectors started discovering white dial explorers, people lost their minds. Because this wasn't just unusual, it violated the DNA of the explorer itself. According to research covered by Hodinkee, fewer than a few dozen albino sport Rolexes are believed to exist among explorers, GMT masters, and submariners. We're talking about absurd rarity. The sort of rarity where wealthy collectors suddenly develop insomnia. The Albino Explorer 6610 became especially legendary. Then came the White Dial 1016. That one detonated the community because the 1016 is the Explorer reference, the archetype, produced from roughly 1963 to 1989, the purest expression of the model. And suddenly, collectors were staring at photographs of one with a white dial like they'd seen Bigfoot driving a Citroen. The problem was Rolex never really confirmed anything. No official records, no explanation, no archival statement saying, yes, we made this weird little snow ghost, which only made collectors more obsessed because uncertainty is jet fuel for Rolex vintage culture. Scholars of the hobby like Eric Wind, Eric Koo, and Ben Clymer have all discussed how early Rolex production was far less standardized than modern collectors assume. Different dials, different suppliers, experimental batches, odd configurations. The 1950s were chaotic. Modern Rolex operates like a pharmaceutical laboratory. 1950s Rolex operated like a brilliant mechanic's garage that happened to accidentally create cultural immortality. And here's the truly fascinating part: white dials weren't actually unheard of in early Rolex sports watches. Even some early Everest associated Oyster Perpetuals had lighter dials, early turnographs, certain prototypes, experimental configurations. The rules hadn't hardened yet. The mythology came later, and somehow these albino watches slipped through before the case closed forever. The Albino Explorer hit the collector's psyche perfectly because it combined three things humans are catastrophically vulnerable to: rarity, mystery, validation. Especially validation. Nothing activates a collector faster than owning something other people didn't know existed. The Albino Explorer became a whispered grail. Auction houses leaned into the mythology. Forums exploded. Instagram collectors posted grainy macro shots with captions that sounded like passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the prices climbed accordingly. But this wasn't just about money. The Albino Explorer challenged the idea that Rolex history was fixed and fully documented. It reminded collectors that vintage watches are messy, human, imperfect. Not every answer exists in an archives. Sometimes history leaks through side doors. And aesthetically, the thing is stunning. The white dial transforms the Explorer entirely. The standard black Explorer feels rugged, stoic, a mountain climber. The albino feels surreal, like the Explorer wandered into a snowstorm and never came back the same. It almost predicts later watches, like the Polar Explorer 2, decades before they existed, which is why modern collectors still obsess over it. Even people who hate vintage Rolex usually stop and stare for a second, because deep down, every collector wants to believe there's still treasure left undiscovered. Human beings cannot resist hidden doors, or secret menus, or forbidden versions of things. Where raccoons with disposable income. Today, The Albino Explorer occupies a strange place in horology. It's not merely rare, it's mythological. The watch represents something bigger than Rolex itself. The idea that even the most studied objects on Earth can still surprise us. In a hobby obsessed with certainty, the Albino Explorer introduced ambiguity. And ambiguity is powerful. It keeps collectors hunting, researching, arguing, dreaming. It helped fuel the modern obsession with obscure vintage variants, tropical dials, military issued oddities, prototype configurations. And honestly, that's the real addiction. Not ownership, but discovery. The Albino Explorer became proof that the rabbit hole never ends. The Explorer was born from Everest, from frostbite, altitude sickness, human stubbornness. A watch forged from one of mankind's greatest adventures. And decades later, one strange little white dial reminded the entire watch world that mystery still exists. No matter how much money enters this hobby, no matter how many auction records get broken, no matter how many people pretend watches are investments, the magic survives in the anomalies, in the weird survivors, in the watches that weren't supposed to exist. The Albino Explorer isn't just rare, it's a ghost story told in steel. And somewhere out there, another collector is probably staring at a blurry auction photo right now, convincing himself he just found one. Humanity, endlessly inventive, endlessly obsessive, occasionally magnificent. Scratches are honesty. Patina is history. For vintage pieces, viva patina.